No one ever tells you this, but I will. There was a time in America when food wasn't just about filling plates, it was about creating memories. Every recipe carried a story of homes where hard work, hope, and a little creativity turned simple ingredients into something extraordinary. Today, we're stepping back into that journey, back to the forgotten dishes that once warmed America's kitchens and hearts. These were the meals that defined households, now living only in faded recipe cards and family stories. So let's begin with a coastal classic that brought the taste of the sea straight to the dinner table: codfish cakes. Codfish cakes. No one ever tells you this, but I will. In the early 1900s, cod wasn't some fancy fish, it was the food of everyday Americans. Cheap, plentiful, and easy to preserve with salt, cod became a lifeline for working families, especially along the New England coast. But the real magic happened when cooks turned this humble catch into something memorable: codfish cakes. The recipe was simple but clever. Families would take leftover salt cod, boil it to soften, and then shred it into flakes. Potatoes, one of the most affordable staples of the time, were mashed in, binding everything together. A touch of onion, maybe a sprinkle of parsley, sometimes even a bit of milk or egg, depending on what was available. Then the mixture was shaped into small patties, fried in a pan until the edges turned crisp and golden. The result was hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying. Each bite carried the briny taste of the sea, mellowed by the earthiness of potatoes. For many, codfish cakes were comfort food long before the term even existed. But this dish wasn't just about flavor, it was about survival and community. Fishermen would sell barrels of salted cod up and down the coast, and recipes like these gave families a way to stretch that purchase for days. In lean times, codfish cakes meant dinner could feed a whole family without breaking the budget. Over the years, as fresh seafood became more available and tastes shifted, codfish cakes slowly disappeared from American tables. Today, they survive mostly in regional cookbooks and the memories of those who grew up with them. Yet for a generation of families, these golden patties were proof that even the simplest ingredients could create a meal worth remembering. Baked salmon loaf. Back in the 1930s and 40s, when every penny counted and fresh fish wasn't always within reach, America found comfort in a surprising hero, the canned salmon tin. Out of that modest can came one of the most beloved yet forgotten dishes of the mid-century kitchen: baked salmon loaf. This was no fancy seafood platter. It was a recipe born from practicality, stretching a single can of salmon into a dinner big enough to feed the whole family. Housewives would carefully flake the salmon, bones and all, mixing it with breadcrumbs, eggs, and milk to create a firm yet tender loaf. Seasonings were simple: salt, pepper, maybe a dash of lemon juice if the budget allowed. Pressed into a pan and baked until golden, it sliced like meatloaf, but with a flavor all its own. For many, this dish carried a sense of pride. It turned something humble and affordable into a centerpiece. During the Great Depression, when meat was scarce and every ingredient had to be stretched, salmon loaf felt like an upgrade, a way to bring a touch of special to the dinner table without breaking the budget. Children often remembered it with a dollop of white sauce or gravy poured over the top, sometimes flavored with dill or mustard. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hearty, nourishing, and made families feel like they were eating something more refined than their circumstances suggested. As America moved into the 1950s and 60s, with supermarkets offering endless choices and convenience foods on the rise, salmon loaf quietly slipped away. Casseroles and TV dinners replaced it, and the humble loaf was left behind. Today, few people even know it existed. But for those who grew up on it, baked salmon loaf was more than just dinner. It was proof that even a simple can could hold the taste of comfort, resilience, and hope. Oyster pie. There was a time in America when oysters weren't considered a delicacy for the wealthy, they were the food of the people. In the 1800s and well into the early 1900s, oysters were cheap, plentiful, and sold on nearly every street corner. Out of this abundance came a dish that once graced countless dinner tables and church suppers: oyster pie. Unlike the refined oyster stews served in upscale restaurants, oyster pie was comfort food at its core. Housewives would layer briny, freshly shucked oysters with crumbled crackers or breadcrumbs, fold in butter, cream, and a touch of onion or celery, then bake it all beneath a golden crust. The result was rich yet simple, a dish that balanced the ocean's saltiness with the warmth of a homemade pie. This pie wasn't just for everyday meals. In many coastal communities, it became a centerpiece for holidays, weddings, and Sunday gatherings. Families remembered the savory aroma filling the kitchen, signaling that a special occasion was near. Children would sit at the table, waiting for that first slice, where the creamy filling bubbled up against the flaky crust. But the story of oyster pie is also tied to changing times. As oyster beds became overharvested and supplies dwindled in the 20th century, prices rose, and what was once common food for working-class families turned into a luxury item. Slowly, recipes like oyster pie faded, tucked away in regional cookbooks and fading family traditions. Yet for those who remember, oyster pie was more than a dish. It was a reminder of when oysters were everyday fare, when communities gathered around hearty meals, and when kitchens turned the bounty of the sea into warmth and comfort. Today, it remains a forgotten gem of American food history, a taste of the past where the simplest ingredients created meals that brought families together. Mock duck. The name alone sparks curiosity. A mock duck? No, it wasn't poultry at all. In fact, this Depression-era favorite was a clever trick of the American kitchen, when real duck was far too expensive for most families. What cooks created instead was an imaginative dish that looked impressive, tasted hearty, and carried the spirit of making do with what you had. Mock duck usually began with beef flank steak, one of the cheapest cuts at the butcher's counter. Housewives would pound it thin, then spread a filling inside, often breadcrumbs, onions, herbs, maybe even a little bacon or sausage if the budget allowed. The meat was rolled tightly, tied with string, browned in a pan, and then baked or braised until tender. When sliced, it revealed beautiful spirals of stuffing, resembling something far more elegant than the humble beef it really was. For families of the 1930s and 40s, this dish wasn't just food, it was showmanship. It turned a tough, inexpensive cut into the centerpiece of Sunday dinner. Served with gravy and mashed potatoes, mock duck carried an air of celebration, proving that you didn't need luxury ingredients to make a meal feel special. Children often remembered the surprise when their mothers announced duck for dinner, only to discover the playful trick once the dish was carved. It was both a meal and a small lesson in thrift and creativity, values that defined American kitchens during hard times. As prosperity returned after World War II and supermarkets overflowed with choices, the need for such culinary disguises faded. Real poultry became affordable, convenience foods took center stage, and mock duck slipped quietly out of memory. Yet, in its own way, mock duck tells a story of resilience. It was a dish born from scarcity but remembered for the joy it brought to the table, proof that even in lean years, food could still carry a touch of magic. Cabbage roll casserole. For immigrant families settling in America during the early 20th century, food was often the bridge between the old world and the new. Among the dishes that made that journey was the humble cabbage roll, meat and rice wrapped in tender cabbage leaves, simmered in tomato sauce. But as life grew busier, many households discovered a quicker, easier way to keep the tradition alive: cabbage roll casserole. Instead of carefully rolling each leaf, cooks layered the ingredients in a baking dish, shredded cabbage on the bottom, seasoned ground beef or pork mixed with rice in the middle, and a tangy tomato sauce poured over the top. Another layer of cabbage went on before the whole dish was baked until bubbling. The result was everything people loved about cabbage rolls, but with half the effort. For families, this casserole wasn't just about convenience, it was about comfort. It reminded them of Sunday dinners back home, of family tables where stories were shared and hands passed heavy serving spoons. In working-class neighborhoods, casseroles like this became staples, stretching a pound of meat into a meal that could feed a crowd. Children remembered the smell most of all, the sweet cabbage mingling with tomatoes, filling the house on cold evenings. Some families sprinkled breadcrumbs or cheese on top for extra richness, while others kept it simple and hearty. However it was made, the dish carried with it a sense of warmth, thrift, and belonging. By the 1950s and 60s, cabbage roll casserole was firmly rooted in American kitchens, but like many old-fashioned recipes, it began to fade as processed foods and instant dinners rose in popularity. Today, it survives mainly in church cookbooks and family traditions. Still, for those who knew it, this casserole wasn't just dinner, it was heritage baked into every layer, a dish that spoke of resilience, tradition, and the power of food to make any place feel like home. Pot roast with root vegetables. If there was ever a dish that defined the meaning of Sunday dinner in America, it was the pot roast with root vegetables. Long before fast food chains and microwave meals, this hearty one-pot classic was the heart of family gatherings, slow-cooked, savory, and steeped in tradition. The recipe was simple, yet timeless. A tough cut of beef, like chuck or brisket, was browned in a heavy pot, then simmered slowly with broth or water. Carrots, potatoes, onions, and sometimes turnips or parsnips were tucked around it, soaking up the rich juices as the meat tenderized over hours. The aroma filled the house, creating a sense of anticipation that built all afternoon. By dinner time, the roast was fork tender, the vegetables sweet and hearty, the gravy rich and comforting. This dish wasn't just food, it was ritual. Families often saved it for Sundays, when everyone could gather around the table after church. Mothers or grandmothers took pride in tending the pot all day, while children waited impatiently, sneaking peeks at the bubbling lid. It was more than nourishment, it was an event that brought families together. During the Depression and war years, pot roast also symbolized resourcefulness. Cooks knew how to take inexpensive cuts of meat and, through patience and care, turn them into something memorable. The root vegetables stretched the meal, ensuring everyone left the table full. For many, the memory of pot roast is tied to warmth, the clink of heavy plates, the steam rising from mashed potatoes drowned in gravy, and the laughter of family echoing around the table. As life grew faster and convenience replaced tradition, the pot roast slowly slipped from the weekly menu. But for those who remember, it remains a symbol of home, patience, and love simmered slowly over the stove, a dish where time itself was the secret ingredient. Spaghetti pie. If you grew up in mid-century America, chances are you remember a quirky dinner that always made kids smile: spaghetti pie. It wasn't Italian, not really. Instead, it was pure American ingenuity, a playful twist that turned leftover pasta into something that felt brand new. The idea was simple. Spaghetti noodles, often from the night before, were mixed with eggs and cheese, then pressed into a pie pan to form a crust. Inside went a savory filling, usually ground beef simmered in tomato sauce, sometimes with onions, peppers, or mushrooms. More cheese topped it off, and the whole thing was baked until the edges crisped and the center bubbled. When sliced, it held together like a casserole but looked like a pie, making dinner feel both familiar and fun. For busy families of the 1950s and 60s, spaghetti pie was the perfect solution. It stretched leftovers into a hearty meal, it looked impressive on the table, and best of all, it got kids excited to eat. mothers clipped the recipe from magazines or community cookbooks, proud of serving something practical that also felt a little creative. The dish carried with it a sense of playfulness. Children loved the novelty of eating pie for dinner, while parents loved the thriftiness of turning scraps into something special. It was also a crowd pleaser for potlucks and church suppers, where a single pan could feed plenty. But like many casserole-style creations, spaghetti pie faded as tastes shifted and pasta dishes became more authentic to their Italian roots. What was once considered clever now seemed old-fashioned, tucked away in recipe boxes of another era. Still, for those who grew up on it, spaghetti pie remains unforgettable, a symbol of creativity in the kitchen, where even yesterday's noodles could be reborn into a meal filled with comfort, laughter, and a touch of surprise. Liver and onions. Few dishes divide memory quite like liver and onions. For some, it was a dreaded weeknight meal, while for others, it was pure comfort, the kind of hearty dish that spoke of thrift, nourishment, and old-fashioned cooking. Either way, this was once a staple on American tables, especially through the 1930s and 40s. Liver was affordable and packed with nutrition, making it a go-to choice during hard times. Housewives and working families alike valued it for being rich in iron and protein, fuel for long days of labor. The preparation was simple yet distinct: slices of beef or calf's liver, dredged lightly in flour, seared in a skillet, and topped with caramelized onions that softened its bold flavor. Served with mashed potatoes or gravy, it was hearty, filling, and practical. For many children, the memory of liver is tied to its strong, unmistakable taste, a taste that often required encouragement from parents at the dinner table. "Eat it, it's good for you," became a familiar refrain across households. But for those who acquired the taste, the dish became a lifelong comfort, a reminder of simpler times when nothing went to waste. Liver and onions also carried a sense of pride. It represented the skill of turning inexpensive cuts into meals that nourished both body and spirit. In rural communities and immigrant households, liver wasn't just a choice, it was tradition, passed down through generations who valued using every part of the animal. As America's diets changed and convenience foods took over, liver lost its place in the weekly rotation. By the late 20th century, it was seen more as an acquired taste than a household necessity. Yet for those who remember, liver and onions holds a place in food history as a dish of resilience, proof that even the strongest flavors can carry the deepest memories of family, tradition, and care. Beef and noodle ring. If there's one dish that captures the creativity of mid-century American cooking, it's the beef and noodle ring. Born in the 1940s and carried through the 50s, this was the kind of recipe that looked impressive on the table while still being practical for busy families. The base was simple: egg noodles mixed with eggs and cheese, pressed into a ring mold or bundt pan, then baked until firm. Once unmolded, it formed a golden pasta crown with a hollow center. Into that center went a savory filling of ground beef, onions, and tomato sauce, sometimes dressed up with mushrooms or peas, depending on what was on hand. The result was a casserole that doubled as a showpiece, combining thrift with a touch of flair. For families, the beef and noodle ring was more than just dinner, it was presentation. In an era when entertaining at home was common, mothers loved serving a dish that drew gasps when carried to the table. Children were just as delighted, marveling at a noodles cake filled with meat. It turned an ordinary meal into something memorable. But the recipe wasn't just about style. Like many mid-century creations, it was built on practicality. Noodles stretched the meat, the filling used affordable pantry staples, and the mold shape meant leftovers reheated neatly the next day. For church suppers, school banquets, and family gatherings, it was a reliable crowd pleaser. Over time, however, mold dishes fell out of fashion. The rise of frozen dinners and modern casseroles pushed aside the quirky charm of ring molds, and the beef and noodle ring quietly disappeared. Today, it survives mostly in vintage cookbooks and faded recipe cards, a reminder of a time when even a simple weekday dinner could be transformed into something playful, creative, and full of heart. Baked chop suey. Few dishes tell the story of America's love for reinvention quite like baked chop suey. While chop suey itself came from Chinese-American restaurants in the late 19th century, it was in mid-century home kitchens that the dish took on a uniquely American twist, baked, hearty, and transformed into a casserole that fed entire families. The recipe usually began with ground beef, macaroni, and canned tomatoes. To this, home cooks added onions, celery, or sometimes green peppers for crunch. Everything was mixed together, seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and maybe a dash of soy sauce, then poured into a casserole dish. A topping of breadcrumbs or shredded cheese often finished it off before it went into the oven, bubbling until golden. For busy households of the 1940s and 50s, baked chop suey checked every box. It was inexpensive, filling, and easy to prepare in large quantities. Mothers clipped the recipe from women's magazines, and it quickly became a weeknight staple, served at dinner tables across America. Some families even brought it to potlucks, where its warm, comforting flavor made it an instant crowd favorite. But beyond convenience, this dish reflected America's growing taste for exotic flavors, simplified for home kitchens. At a time when international foods were still a novelty, baked chop suey offered a touch of the unfamiliar while staying firmly rooted in the comfort of casseroles. It was adventurous, yet safe, a glimpse of global cuisine adapted to everyday life. Over time, as authentic Asian dishes became more widely available and tastes shifted, baked chop suey faded from memory. What once felt exciting and practical soon seemed outdated. Another casserole lost to changing trends. Still, for those who grew up with it, baked chop suey was more than dinner. It was a symbol of an era when America's kitchens weren't afraid to experiment, blending tradition and imagination into meals that brought families together. No one ever tells you this, but I will. These forgotten recipes weren't just dinners, they were memories, traditions, and proof that even simple ingredients could bring families together. From codfish cakes to baked chop suey, each dish carried a story of resilience and creativity, reminding us of a time when the kitchen was the heart of every home. Though many of these meals have slipped into the past, they live on in the stories we tell, and in the chance to bring them back to our own tables. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to subscribe and join me as we uncover more lost recipes from America's past. Because history isn't just written, it's tasted.